Oh my God, you are just too much. You are too loud, and look at this. You are too dark. I can't stand you.
Why do you think I left you? I'm sick and tired of this.
Grace Ashford was not a woman who second-guessed herself. She hadn't been, not before Edward. But there she was, standing in a mirrored elevator in the heart of Gangnam, Seoul, pressing her twist-out flat against the side of her head with her palm like she could iron out everything that made her before the doors opened. She caught herself mid-press and stopped. Her hand dropped slowly. She stared at her reflection, really stared. The woman looking back at her had deep brown skin that the Seoul autumn light hit like warm copper. Full lips. Big eyes that held everything she was feeling whether she wanted them to or not. Natural hair that, left alone, reached for the sky like it had somewhere to be. She had spent 4 years pressing it down. The elevator doors opened. Grace squared her shoulders, picked up her portfolio, and walked into the offices of Hana Creative Group like she belonged there. Because she did. She was the cultural liaison for Monroe & Voss, a U.S. fashion brand making its first serious push into the Korean market. She spoke conversational Korean, understood the cultural nuances her colleagues fumbled through, and had been specifically requested for this sole assignment by the regional director. She was good at her job. That, Edward had never been able to take from her. Her phone buzzed as she settled into the conference room. "Diane, did you land? Are you alive? Is Seoul beautiful? Are there cute men?" Grace smiled despite herself and typed back, "I landed. I'm alive. Yes. Mind your business." 3 seconds later, "Grace Ashford, that is my business. Call me after your meeting." She silenced her phone just as her Korean counterpart, a precise woman named Ms. O, entered the room with 2 junior staff trailing behind her. The meeting was formal, structured, everything laid out in careful English for Grace's benefit, though Grace had already read every document in Korean the night before on the plane. She let them explain. She asked her questions at the right moments. She was exactly what Monroe & Voss had sent her to be. Then one of the junior staff, young, nervous, trying to make a good impression, knocked his entire cup of water directly into his own laptop. The sound it made was spectacular. The look on his face was more spectacular. Grace pressed her lips together. She tried. She genuinely tried. The laugh came out anyway. Not a polite, corporate laugh. Not the carefully modulated chuckle she had trained herself to produce in Edward's company. The real one, the one that started somewhere in her chest and arrived in the room like it had been waiting for permission. Loud, full, completely, catastrophically unfiltered. The room went quiet. Ms. O blinked. Grace cleared her throat. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I apologize." She was already pulling napkins from the center of the table and passing them across. "Here, quickly, turn it upside down." The junior staff member, mortified 2 seconds ago, started laughing too, then the other one. Then carefully, Miss O allowed herself a small dignified smile. The tension broke. The meeting continued. But on the walk back to her temporary apartment that evening, Grace thought about that laugh. About how quickly she had apologized for it. About how 4 years of Grace, "You don't have to be so loud," and Grace, "We're in public," and Grace, "Can you just," had turned her instinct for joy into something she treated like an accident. Did he know what he had? She didn't know where that thought came from. She pushed it aside. Diane picked up on the first ring. "Tell me everything." "There's nothing to tell. I had a meeting. I laughed too loud." Standard Grace behavior. "You apologized for it, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Grace was quiet 1 beat too long. Grace. "I'm fine, Diane. You broke up with Edward 8 months ago and you're still apologizing for your laugh. That man did a number on you. Can we not do this tonight? I just got here." "Fine. But I want you to promise me something." Diane's voice shifted, softer now. "This is a new city, new country. You don't owe anybody the small version of yourself, okay? Not anymore." Grace looked out at the Gangnam streetlights bleeding orange and gold against the dark sky. Seoul at night was enormous and indifferent, and somehow, that felt like freedom. "Okay," she said quietly. "I promise." She almost meant it. She turned the corner toward her building and walked straight into a wall. Except it wasn't a wall. It was a man, tall, dark-suited, completely still in the way that very few people manage to be still. Like stillness was something he'd decided on, rather than something that had happened to him. Grace stumbled back. "I'm so sorry, I wasn't sorry." The men around him, and there were men around him, she registered that now, 4 of them forming a loose perimeter on the pavement, shifted slightly. Not aggressively, just aware. The man himself looked at her. Not past her, not through her. At her, with dark, unhurried eyes that took in her face the way someone reads something they find genuinely interesting. He said nothing. Grace, who always filled silence, found she had nothing either. She stepped around him and walked the rest of the way to her building without looking back. But at her door, key already in the lock, she felt it. The specific weight of being watched by someone who actually sees you. She told herself it meant nothing. She almost believed that, too. If you've ever been told you were too much, too loud, too emotional, too yourself, drop a comment. Like this video, subscribe to Afro Seoul Mafia Diaries, and stay right here, because this story is only getting deeper. Grace found out on a Tuesday. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of the Hana Creative Group offices, coffee in hand, watching the morning traffic crawl through Gangnam below, when Ms. O appeared at her elbow with a tablet and an expression that suggested she was delivering information she found both relevant and slightly uncomfortable. "I thought you should know," Ms. O said, pulling up a corporate profile. "The building we operate from, and the 3 surrounding properties in this block, are owned by YMJ Holdings." Grace looked at the tablet. Clean website, minimal design. The kind of corporate presence that communicated, "We don't need to impress you." YMJ, Grace repeated. "And that's relevant, because the J," Ms. O said carefully, "stands for J, as in Yoon Min Jae. He is our indirect landlord, you could say." She paused. "He attended last quarter's partner dinner. We expect he may attend this quarter's as well, next Friday." Grace handed the tablet back. "Okay, good to know." She said it like it meant nothing. It meant something, she just hadn't figured out what yet. The rooftop restaurant on Friday evening was the kind of place that made you feel like Seoul had been specifically arranged below for your viewing pleasure. Warm lighting, long tables dressed in white, the city laid out beyond the glass railings like a map of somewhere important. Grace wore a deep burgundy wrap dress and her hair out, fully out, no compromise. A decision she'd made standing in front of her bathroom mirror that morning while Diane's voice played in her head. The small version of yourself. Not tonight. She was mid-conversation with the Monroe and Voss regional director, Mr. Park, laughing at something he'd said about the translation error that had nearly ended a campaign last year, when she felt it. That same quality of attention from across a room. Specific, unhurried. She glanced sideways. Yoon Min Jae was seated 2 tables away, in conversation with 2 men in suits, who were doing most of the talking. He wasn't looking at her, but something about the angle of his stillness suggested he had been a moment ago. He looked exactly as he had on that Gangnam pavement. Dark suit. Controlled. The kind of man who had decided a long time ago that the world would come to him. Grace looked away first. The dinner moved into toasts. Mr. Park nudged her gently. A light encouragement. Grace had been practicing. She stood, raised her glass, and delivered what she was fairly confident was a well-structured toast in Korean about partnership and shared vision and the particular excitement of new beginnings. The table was politely, carefully quiet. Ms. O leaned over and murmured, "You said fermented partnership, instead of fruitful." Grace stared at her. Then she laughed. Loud, immediate, completely unplanned, her hand coming up to cover her mouth half a second too late. "I said fermented?" Quite clearly. "Oh my." She was still laughing, shaking her head, and Mr. Park started laughing too. And then the table collapsed into genuine warmth rather than corporate politeness. And Grace thought, This is what happens when you stop performing. She didn't look across the room, but she felt, with quiet certainty, that someone had. The rain started as the dinner wrapped up. Not a drizzle, Seoul had apparently decided on commitment tonight. Grace stood at the restaurant entrance watching it sheet down while the other guests filtered past her into waiting cars. Her cab app was showing 40 minutes. She had no umbrella. She had a burgundy dress and very specific feelings about what rain did to natural hair. She was calculating whether she could make a run for the covered walkway 2 blocks down, when a black car pulled up quietly in front of her. The driver's window came down. A man in a dark jacket, not Min Jae, one of his said simply, "Mr. Yoon offers a ride." Grace looked at the car, looked at the rain and looked back at the car. "I'm fine, thank you." The driver nodded once and stayed exactly where he was. 40 seconds passed. The rain intensified. Grace's cab app updated to 52 minutes. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't know him." The driver nodded again. Stayed. Grace pulled her portfolio closer to her chest. "I'm genuinely fine." The back window came down. Yoon Min Jae looked out at her with the expression of a man who had long since stopped wasting words. "It's raining," he said. "Get in." 2 words. Declarative. Not a command exactly, more like a statement of the only logical conclusion available. Grace looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the rain. Then, with the specific dignity of a woman making a practical decision that had nothing to do with dark eyes and expensive suits, she got in the car. The interior was quiet, warm, the kind of car where the outside world became immediately theoretical. Min Jae was on his side of the seat, she was on hers, and the distance between them was perfectly maintained and somehow still felt like the smallest space she'd ever occupied with another person. She gave the driver her address. Nobody spoke. Grace, who filled silence the way water fills a container, sat with it. She watched the rain-blurred city slide past the window and told herself she was perfectly comfortable. "You always laugh like that?" His voice was low, not unfriendly, genuinely curious in the way of someone who didn't ask questions they didn't want answered. Grace turned to look at him. Here it was. "You're too loud, Grace. You embarrassed yourself, Grace." She braced for the shape of it. "Like what?" she said evenly. He looked at her for exactly long enough to make the question feel considered. "Like you mean it." Grace opened her mouth and then closed it. She turned back to the window, because she genuinely did not know what to do with that sentence, and she needed a moment to find her footing, and the city outside was a very convenient place to look. "Sometimes," she said finally, quietly. He didn't respond, but the silence after it felt different from the silence before it. The car stopped outside her building. She gathered her things, reached for the door, then paused. "Thank you," she said, "for the ride." He inclined his head slightly. Not a bow, just acknowledgement. Like receiving thanks was something he allowed rather than expected. She got out. The car didn't pull away until she was through the front door. Upstairs, Grace sat on the edge of her bed in her dress and replayed those 4 words. "Like you mean it." Edward, in 4 years, had never once said anything like that. The flowers arrived on Monday morning, sitting on Grace's desk like they'd always belonged there. White orchids. No vase fuss, no oversized arrangement trying to announce itself, just a clean, deliberate bundle wrapped in plain paper. Grace stood in the doorway of her temporary office staring at them like they might explain themselves. There was a small card tucked between the stems. She picked it up. "You mispronounced it again at breakfast." No name. No need for one. Grace's stomach did something complicated. She thought back. Saturday morning, the small cafe 2 streets from her apartment, where she'd been practicing ordering in Korean with the barista, stumbling over a tone, laughing at herself, trying again. She hadn't seen him there. She was certain she hadn't seen him there, which meant he had seen her. She sat down at her desk, set the orchids carefully to one side, and tried to focus on her morning emails. She lasted maybe 4 minutes before she picked the card back up and read it again. "Those are nice." Grace looked up. Ms. O was standing in the doorway, eyebrows raised with the particular interest of someone who noticed everything, and said nothing about most of it. "They're from a client," Grace said. Ms. O's expression suggested she had opinions about which client, but had decided, generously, to keep them to herself. "Your 11 o'clock is here." The week moved like that, ordinary on the surface, charged underneath. A text from an unknown number on Wednesday. "There's a place 2 blocks from your office. Better coffee than the chain you keep using." No signature. Grace didn't need one. She didn't reply. But on Thursday, on her lunch break, she found herself walking 2 blocks in the opposite direction from her usual coffee shop. The cafe was small, unmarked from the street. The kind of place that didn't need a sign, because everyone who needed to find it already knew where it was. Min Jae was at a corner table, a newspaper folded beside an untouched cup, like he'd been expecting her exact arrival time down to the minute. "You came?" he said, not smug, just observational. "I was curious about the coffee." Grace sat down across from him, setting her bag down with more composure than she felt. "That's all this is." "Of course." A server appeared, set a cup in front of her without being asked, and disappeared. Grace looked at it, then at him. "You ordered for me?" "I guessed. You drink it black, no sugar. You don't trust the sweetness you didn't ask for." Grace stared at him. "That's a very specific thing to guess." "I notice things," he said it simply, without performance. The way other men might say, "I work in finance." She picked up the cup, took a sip. It was, infuriatingly, exactly how she liked it. They ate, and he watched her eat with an attention that should have made her self-conscious and somehow didn't. She ordered the full lunch set, didn't pick at it, didn't apologize for her appetite the way she'd trained herself to over 4 years of Edward's quiet commentary about portion sizes and watching it. "You eat like you mean that too," Min Jae said after a while. Grace put her fork down. "Is that a thing you say to all the women you meet?" "I don't meet many women," he said. "Most women I encounter eat like they're apologizing for being hungry. Like wanting something is a confession." He studied her. "You don't do that." Grace felt something tighten in her chest, not discomfort exactly. Recognition. The specific ache of being seen accurately after a long time of being seen wrong. "I used to," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. He didn't push, he just waited, the way a person waits when they actually want to hear the answer rather than just filling silence. "I was with someone," Grace continued, 4 years. He had this way of making everything sound like a suggestion for my own good. Maybe a smaller portion, maybe quieter, maybe less." She stopped. "I got really good at less." "Did it work?" "Did what work?" "Being less. Did it make him happier?" Grace thought about it honestly, maybe for the first time. No, there was always something else, something more to trim. Min Jae was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slightly on the table, an oddly human gesture from a man who otherwise seemed built from stillness. "In my world," he said finally, "everyone performs. Loyalty, respect, fear, all performance, all the time. I have spent my whole life watching people show me a version of themselves they think I want." His eyes met hers. "You don't do that. Whatever you are in a room, you simply are it. It's unusual. Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation, a pause. Don't shrink. Whatever made you think you needed to, it was wrong." Grace didn't have a response for that. She drank her coffee instead, and the silence between them, again, felt different from ordinary silence. She walked back to the office 15 minutes later than her lunch break technically allowed, and didn't particularly care. It was Ms. O who found her at her desk that afternoon, tablet in hand again, expression different this time, less amused, more careful. "Grace, do you have a minute?" "Of course." Ms. O set the tablet down. It was open to a news archive, a photograph of Min Jae, outside a courthouse, 2 years old, flanked by lawyers, his expression as unreadable then as it was now. The headline beneath it was in Korean, but Grace's reading was good enough now to catch the shape of it. "Investigation into Yoon Min Jae's organization continues amid silence from prosecutors." "I wanted you to see this," Ms. O said carefully, "because I noticed the orchids, and I noticed you've been distracted." She wasn't unkind about it. "He's not just a landlord, Grace. People who cross him disappear from conversations, not always literally, but often enough that no one asks." Grace stared at the screen. At his face. The same face that had asked her if her laugh meant something, that had ordered her coffee black with no sugar, because he'd noticed she didn't trust unearned sweetness. "I appreciate you telling me," Grace said quietly. Ms. O nodded once and left her alone with it. Grace sat there for a long time after, the orchids on the corner of her desk, the cursor blinking on an unanswered email, the city moving on outside her window like nothing had shifted. The most feared man in Seoul. She thought about Edward's slow, careful cruelty, 4 years of a man who'd never once made her feel unsafe, and had still managed to make her disappear. She thought about a man who, by every account, should have terrified her, and who was the first person in years to tell her not to shrink. She didn't know yet which one was the dangerous one. The text came through on a Sunday morning, while Grace was still in bed scrolling through nothing in particular. Edward, I'm in Seoul for work. Crazy, right? I would love to catch up if you're free. No pressure. Grace stared at the screen for a long moment. 4 words stood out to her, the way certain words do when you've spent years learning to read between someone's lines. No pressure. Edward had never once applied pressure directly. That wasn't his method. His method was suggestion, soft erosion, 1,000 small comments delivered with a smile. She should have said no. She typed back, sure. Coffee Tuesday? She told herself it was closure. She told herself she was simply a different woman now, one who could sit across from her past without it touching her present. She believed this right up until she saw him walking toward their table at the cafe, blazer perfectly pressed, smile arranged exactly the way she remembered, and felt her spine straighten on instinct, an old automatic bracing she hadn't fully unlearned. Grace. He said her name like an accomplishment. You look, he paused, taking her in. Well, Seoul agrees with you. Thank you. How's the trip? They made the kind of conversation 2 people make when there's 4 years of history sitting at the table with them, uninvited. Work. Mutual friends. His engagement, Carolyn. He said her name like he expected Grace to ask follow-up questions about her, which Grace did not. Then, carefully, almost gently, he said, You seem different. Different how? Lighter, maybe. He tilted his head, studying her the way he used to study a room, before deciding how loud he'd allow her to be in it. I'm glad. Seoul must be a lot, though, right? New culture, new language, all that energy at once. It must be overwhelming for you. Grace felt something small and familiar pull tight in her chest. I'm managing fine. I'm sure you are. He smiled, reaching for his coffee. You always were a lot to take in unfamiliar places. I just mean it takes a certain kind of person to handle a city like this without getting lost in it. There it was. The same sentence structure he'd used for 4 years, dressed up as a compliment, landing exactly where it always landed, somewhere just beneath her ribs. You always were a lot. Not loud, not too much, just a lot. Something to be handled, managed, survived. Grace looked at him, really looked, the way she'd learned to look at things in the last several weeks, without the soft filter of wanting him to be different than he was. Edward, she said slowly, do you hear what you just said? He blinked. What? You said I was a lot to take in unfamiliar places, like I'm weather. Her voice was calm, that surprised her most, how calm it was. You did that for 4 years. You'd say something that sounded almost kind, and underneath it was always the same message. Grace, you're too much. Grace, manage yourself. Grace, be smaller so I don't have to deal with all of you. That's not... Edward straightened, genuine surprise crossing his face. I never said you were too much. You never had to say it directly. That was never your style. Grace shook her head slowly. You just made sure I felt it every single day until I started doing the work for you. The cafe around them continued, oblivious spoons against cups, quiet conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine. Grace stood, gathering her bag with hands that, miraculously, weren't shaking. It was good seeing you, Edward. I hope Carolyn knows what she has. She paused at the edge of the table. I hope she never has to find out the hard way what it costs to keep making herself smaller for you. She walked out without waiting for a response. Outside, the Seoul afternoon was bright and indifferent, and Grace stood on the sidewalk for a moment just breathing, replaying what she'd said, half stunned that she'd actually said it. She didn't notice the black car parked across the street until her phone rang 20 minutes later, back in her apartment, sitting on the edge of her bed with her shoes still on. She didn't recognize the number, but she knew the voice the second it spoke. Who was the man at the cafe? Grace sat up straight. How do you... You looked smaller when you walked away from him. Min-jae's voice was even, unhurried, but there was something underneath it she hadn't heard before. Something that wasn't quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood as it. I've watched you in rooms for weeks now. You don't look small. Today, for a moment, you did. Grace closed her eyes. It was my ex. Edward. He's in Seoul for work. We had coffee. A pause stretched long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Did he know what he had? Grace didn't answer right away. She thought about 4 years of small erosions, of a love that had asked her to disappear 1 inch at a time, of a man who'd called her a lot in a tone soft enough to sound like affection. No, she said finally, quietly. I don't think he ever did. Another pause, then, low and certain, in a way that settled somewhere deep in her chest. He didn't. The line went quiet again, not dead, just still, the kind of silence two people share when neither wants to be the one to end it. Grace, Min-jae said eventually. Yes? Whatever he made you believe about yourself, it was a lie he needed in order to feel large. A beat. You were never the problem. Grace sat on the edge of her bed in her empty apartment, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not safe, exactly. Something closer to being seen all the way through, and not flinching from it. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, he said. I only said what was true. That line right there. He only said what was true. Comment if it hit you the way it hit Grace. Min-jae came to her on a Thursday evening, unannounced, which Grace would later realize was its own kind of statement. A man who controlled every variable in his life had shown up without warning her first, without giving himself the option to retreat if it went wrong. She opened the door still in her work clothes, blouse half untucked, and found him standing in the hallway of her building looking, for the first time since she'd known him, faintly uncertain. I should have called, he said. You should have, Grace agreed. Then she stepped back and let him in anyway. Her apartment was small, temporary, nothing like the world he moved through, no marble, no quiet men at the door. He looked around it like he was cataloging something, like the ordinariness of it interested him more than the penthouses he probably owned. I wanted to tell you something, he said, once they were both standing in her narrow living room, neither of them sitting, the air between them thick with the specific tension of two people who have been circling a thing for weeks. Something I haven't told anyone in a long time. Grace crossed her arms, not defensively, just to give her hands something to do. Okay. My father built what I run now, Min-jae said. I didn't choose this life. I was given it the way you're given a name. I was 12 the first time someone called me his successor instead of his son. He paused, and something in his face shifted, some careful architecture coming down for just a moment. I don't know what it is to be wanted for anything other than what I can do, or what I control, until you. Grace felt the words land somewhere underneath her ribs, in the same place Edward's quiet cruelties used to live. Except this was the opposite of that. This was something filling a space instead of carving one out. I laughed at you, she said quietly. The first week. Loud, in front of your men, on the street. I wasn't trying to impress you. I think that's the only reason you noticed me. It is. She sat down slowly on the arm of her couch, and he stayed standing, and she realized he was waiting, actually waiting, the way he had in the cafe weeks ago, for her to decide if she trusted him enough to keep going. I'll tell you something too, Grace said. Something I never told Edward, not in 4 years. He didn't speak. He just watched her with the same unhurried attention he'd given her the first night in the rain. Before Edward, I used to want things, loudly. I wanted to run my own studio one day. I wanted to take up an entire room with my opinions. I wanted to be exactly this much. She spread her arms slightly. And not an inch less. And somewhere in those 4 years I stopped wanting things out loud. I started wanting them quietly, in case wanting them at all was already too much. And now? Grace looked up at him. Now I'm in Seoul, and the most feared man in the city told me not to shrink, and I think I'm starting to remember how to want things loudly again. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but lived close enough to one that Grace felt it like warmth. He sat down beside her, close but not crowding her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Grace felt the old instinct rise in her chest, the familiar pull to fill the silence, to make herself smaller and more agreeable so the moment wouldn't feel so exposed. She let the silence stay instead. I leave Seoul in 6 weeks, she said eventually. My assignment ends. I know. Does that scare you? Whatever this is, having an expiration date? Min-jae considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. I've spent my whole life being afraid of the wrong things. Rivals, exposure, losing control of what I've built. He looked at her steadily. I'm not afraid of 6 weeks, Grace. I'm afraid of what happens if I let you believe, even for a day, that you need to be smaller for this to work. Grace felt something in her chest crack open. Not painfully, just completely. Then don't, she said simply. Let me be all of it. The whole thing, loud, and a lot, and exactly this much. I intend to, he said, let you be exactly that. They didn't kiss that night. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and somehow more permanent. Two people sitting in a small temporary apartment in a city neither of them had built for the other, choosing, deliberately, not to perform anything at all. Later, after he'd gone, Grace video called Diane, propping her phone against a stack of books on her kitchen counter while she made tea. Okay, Diane said, the second her face filled the screen. You have a look. What happened? Nothing happened. Grace. Diane, I promise. You're glowing. Don't lie to me. I've known you since college. Grace laughed, and it came out the way it used to, before Edward, before 4 years of learning to apologize for the size of her own joy. Loud, unfiltered. Completely without permission from anyone. She didn't pull it back. She walked to her window instead, phone still in hand, and looked out at Seoul spread beneath her. Lit up. Enormous. Indifferent. Alive. The city that had handed her a feared man, who saw her clearly when the safe one never had. I think, Grace said slowly, I'm finally somewhere that fits. She had spent 4 years making herself smaller for a man who still wasn't satisfied. It took the most feared man in Seoul to show her she was never the problem. She had simply, finally, found someone who didn't need her to be anything less than exactly enough. If Grace's ending hit you, comment your favorite line below. I read every single one. Hit like, subscribe to Afro Mafia Diaries so you never miss the next story. See you in the next one.